What if the greatest military operation in human history almost never happened? Not because of German defenses, not because of weather, not because of logistics, but because of one man's stubborn resistance, a man who was supposed to be America's closest ally. The year was 1943, and behind closed doors, in smoke-filled rooms and tense diplomatic suites, a battle of wills was being fought that would determine the fate of millions. Winston Churchill, the lion-hearted Prime Minister of Great Britain, was doing everything in his power to delay, derail, and redirect the cross-channel invasion that Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his generals had come to see as the only true path to victory in Europe. The tension between these two men, allies bound by necessity, rivals shaped by pride and conflicting strategy, reached its breaking point across a series of critical meetings that history has rarely examined with the honesty they deserve. This is the story of how Roosevelt, quiet but iron-willed, ultimately forced Churchill's hand, and in doing so, changed the course of the 20th century forever. If this kind of deep historical storytelling is what you've been searching for, then right now is the moment to subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and share this video with someone who loves real history, not the sanitized version, but the raw, human, complicated truth. And when you're done watching, leave a comment below telling us something you didn't know before, or what surprised you most about this story. Your engagement means everything and helps this channel bring more stories like this one to life. To understand why Roosevelt had to force Churchill's hand, you must first understand what Churchill feared. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill had lived through the catastrophic failures of the First World War. He had been the architect of the Gallipoli Campaign of 1915, a disastrous amphibious assault on the Ottoman Empire that had ended in humiliation, with over 250,000 Allied casualties and Churchill's own resignation from government. That failure had never left him. It lived in his bones. When American generals, like George C. Marshall, began pushing aggressively in 1942 for a direct cross-channel assault into Nazi-occupied France, a plan that would eventually become Operation Overlord, Churchill saw not bold strategy, but the ghost of Gallipoli resurrected on a grander and more terrible scale. He envisioned British and American boys drowning in the English Channel, cut down on fortified beaches, sacrificed to a plan he considered reckless, premature, and strategically blind. Churchill was not a coward. He was, by any measure, one of the most courageous leaders of the 20th century. But courage and stubbornness share the same root, and in 1942 and 1943, those two qualities became indistinguishable in the mind of the British Prime Minister. Franklin Delano Roosevelt entered the alliance with Churchill already understanding one fundamental truth about his British counterpart. Churchill was a brilliant man who needed to be managed. Roosevelt, paralyzed from the waist down since 1921 due to polio, had developed over decades of political survival an extraordinary ability to read people, to maneuver without appearing to maneuver, and to pursue goals through patience and indirection rather than direct confrontation. He liked Churchill personally, genuinely, but he also recognized that the Prime Minister's strategic vision was shaped by British imperial interests as much as by any purely military logic. Churchill's preferred approach to defeating Nazi Germany ran through the Mediterranean, through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and what he famously called the soft underbelly of Europe. Roosevelt generals, particularly Marshall, saw this Mediterranean strategy as a dangerous distraction, a way of bleeding Allied resources in secondary theaters, while Germany fortified the Atlantic Wall and consolidated its hold on Western Europe. The argument was not merely strategic. It was existential. Every month of delay gave Hitler more time to build, to dig in, to prepare. And Roosevelt knew it. The first major confrontation over Allied strategy came at the Casablanca Conference, held in Morocco from January 14th to January 24th, 1943. Roosevelt flew secretly across the Atlantic, the first sitting American president to travel by airplane during wartime, and met Churchill in the sun-bleached luxury of the Anfa Hotel, surrounded by palm trees and the quiet menace of wartime security. Joseph Stalin had been invited, but declined, citing the desperate ongoing battle at Stalingrad, where Soviet forces were in the final, apocalyptic stages of encircling Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus and his German Sixth Army. At Casablanca, Churchill arrived with a full team of highly prepared military planners, while the American delegation, caught somewhat off guard by British organizational thoroughness, found themselves outmaneuvered in the planning sessions. The result was a compromise. The Allies agreed to invade Sicily next, as Churchill wanted, rather than moving immediately toward France. Roosevelt accepted this, partly because Marshall and the American chiefs were not yet fully prepared to win a direct strategic argument, and partly because Roosevelt understood that trust needed to be built before the decisive confrontation could come. But he had not given up. He had simply chosen his moment. What Churchill did not fully appreciate in early 1943 was how rapidly American industrial and military power was transforming the balance of the alliance. When the United States had entered the war in December 1941, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th of that year, Britain was the senior partner in terms of experience, deployed forces, and strategic planning infrastructure. But by mid-1943, that equation was reversing with startling speed. American shipyards were producing Liberty ships at a rate that defied imagination. American factories were churning out Sherman tanks, P-51 Mustangs, and B-17 Flying Fortresses by the thousands. The draft had filled the United States Army with millions of young men who were being trained, equipped, and readied for large-scale conventional warfare. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had been given command of Allied forces in North Africa in November 1942, was gaining the organizational and political experience that would make him the ideal supreme commander for a cross-channel invasion. The United States was no longer the junior partner, and Roosevelt, with characteristic patience, was waiting for the right moment to make that new reality felt. The pivotal turning point came at the Trident Conference in Washington, D.C., held from May 12 to May 25, 1943. Churchill sailed across the Atlantic aboard the Queen Mary, now converted to a troopship, and arrived in Washington determined once again to press his Mediterranean strategy. He wanted to exploit the anticipated Allied victory in North Africa, which was completed on May 13, 1943, when the last Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered, and push through Italy toward what he believed was the strategic heart of Axis power in southern Europe. Roosevelt and Marshall were equally determined that this time, a firm commitment to the cross-channel invasion must be extracted. Not a vague promise, not a conditional agreement, but a concrete date, a specific allocation of resources, and an irreversible strategic commitment. The debates inside the Federal Reserve Building, where the combined chiefs met, were fierce. British generals argued that conditions in France were not yet favorable. American generals argued that no conditions would ever be perfect, and that delay served only the enemy. Roosevelt, receiving daily briefings and participating in key sessions, was watching the debate with the calculating attention of a man who had already decided the outcome. This is the midpoint of the story. And if you're finding this as gripping as we do, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and like this video. It takes only a second, and it makes an enormous difference. Share this with a friend, a history lover, a teacher, anyone who deserves to know the real story of how the greatest military operation in history was almost strangled before it began. And drop a comment below. Tell us what you knew before watching this, and what has surprised you. Now let's go back to Washington, May 1943, where the fate of the invasion hung by the thinnest of threads. At the Trident Conference, General George C. Marshall presented the American case with the methodical, almost prosecutorial force that had made him the most respected military officer in Washington. Marshall argued that the Allied commitment to the Mediterranean was consuming landing craft, troops, and logistical capacity that were essential for a cross-channel operation. Every Italian campaign was a campaign fought instead of France. Every month in the Mediterranean was a month given to Erwin Rommel's successors to fortify the beaches of Normandy. Churchill countered brilliantly, as he always did, with eloquence and historical analogy and strategic nuance. But this time, Roosevelt supported Marshall in a way that made the American position unmistakable. A date was set. May 1, 1944, would be the target date for Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of France. A supreme commander would be appointed. Landing craft would be reserved. The decision was formalized. Churchill had accepted, not with joy, not with enthusiasm, but with a grim recognition that the Americans had the power, the numbers, and the political will to insist, and that resisting any further would fracture the alliance itself. Yet Churchill did not surrender entirely or immediately. In August 1943, at the First Quebec Conference, codenamed Quadrant, held from August 17th to August 24th at the Château Frontenac, Churchill attempted once more to introduce conditions, qualifications, and alternative scenarios that might delay or redirect the cross-channel commitment. He raised concerns about the strength of German forces in France. He proposed expanding operations in Italy, which had entered the war in July with the Allied invasion of Sicily and the subsequent overthrow of Benito Mussolini on July 25, 1943. He suggested that if the Italian campaign went well enough, resources might need to be redirected. Roosevelt, now operating from a position of clear strategic dominance, refused to allow these qualifications to undermine the May 1944 commitment. The Americans controlled the resources, the manpower, and the momentum. Roosevelt had also begun maneuvering around a question that would further alter the alliance dynamic. Who would command Operation Overlord? Many assumed it would be Marshall. Roosevelt himself had initially favored Marshall. But a different decision was being contemplated, one that would have profound consequences. The question of supreme command for Operation Overlord was resolved at the Tehran Conference, held from November 28 to December 1, 1943, the first wartime meeting of the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Joseph Stalin. Tehran was the farthest Roosevelt had ever traveled, and the journey was arduous for a man in his physical condition. But he went, because Tehran was where the final strategic architecture of the war would be determined. Stalin, commanding the largest land army in the world, which was bleeding the Wehrmacht white on the Eastern Front in titanic battles, like Kursk in July 1943, had one demand above all others. The cross-channel invasion must happen, and it must happen soon. Stalin had been demanding a second front since 1941. His armies had suffered casualties that staggered the imagination. The Soviet Union would ultimately lose an estimated 27 million people in the war. He had no patience for Mediterranean strategies that he privately, and sometimes publicly, interpreted as Anglo-American willingness to let Russia bear the burden of destroying Germany while they maneuvered for peripheral advantage. At Tehran, Stalin's support for Roosevelt's position transformed the dynamic entirely. When Stalin directly challenged Churchill on the question of the cross-channel invasion, asking bluntly whether the British truly believed in Overlord or merely spoke of it as a formality, Churchill found himself isolated in a way that had never happened before. Roosevelt, in a strategic move of considerable boldness, had actually begun staying at the Soviet embassy in Tehran, officially for security reasons, but in a way that physically and symbolically aligned him with Stalin against Churchill's Mediterranean preferences. The three men sat around the table at the Soviet embassy, and the pressure on Churchill was immense. Stalin pressed for a specific date. Roosevelt supported the commitment. Churchill, surrounded, outmaneuvered, and confronted with the unified will of his two most powerful allies, formally and definitively accepted Operation Overlord as the primary Allied strategy for 1944. He also accepted that the appointment of a supreme commander must be made immediately, and Roosevelt, in a decision that stunned many, chose Dwight D. Eisenhower over Marshall, telling Marshall personally that he could not afford to let him go from Washington. Eisenhower received word of his appointment in December 1943 and immediately began the monumental task of planning the invasion that Churchill had spent 2 years trying to prevent, delay, and redirect. The plan that emerged, developed by Eisenhower and his Chief of Staff General Walter Bedell Smith, with critical contributions from British General Bernard Montgomery, who commanded the ground forces, called for a landing on 5 beaches along the coast of Normandy in northern France: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The date was pushed slightly from May 1st to early June 1944 to allow more time for preparation and to accumulate sufficient landing craft. The Germans under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and Commander-in-Chief Westgerd von Rundstedt were fortifying the Atlantic Wall, a vast system of bunkers, obstacles, artillery positions, and defensive installations stretching from Norway to the French-Spanish border. Operation Fortitude, one of the most elaborate deception campaigns in military history, was designed to convince the Germans that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Every piece of the plan reflected the absolute necessity of secrecy, surprise, and overwhelming force, precisely the conditions that Churchill had feared could never be achieved. On June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord was launched. In the early hours of the morning, over 24,000 American, British, and Canadian airborne troops parachuted and glided into Normandy behind German lines. At dawn, the largest naval armada in human history, nearly 7,000 vessels, approached the Normandy coast. Over 156,000 Allied troops stormed the 5 beaches under fire, facing German resistance that ranged from scattered and confused to ferociously lethal, particularly at Omaha Beach, where American forces suffered approximately 2,000 casualties in a single day of fighting. By nightfall, despite the blood and chaos and the terrible human cost, all 5 beaches had been secured. The Allies had their foothold in France. Operation Overlord, the plan that Churchill had doubted, delayed, and fought against for 2 years, was a success. Paris would be liberated on August 25, 1944. Germany would surrender on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was won through the very strategy that Roosevelt had insisted upon, that Stalin had demanded, and that Churchill had, in the end, been forced to accept. History does not always reward the person who was right from the beginning. Churchill, for all his resistance, served magnificently as a war leader and remained one of the towering figures of the 20th century. But the record is clear. The cross-channel invasion that ended Hitler's war in Europe was nearly strangled in its cradle by the man who should have been its most enthusiastic champion. It was Roosevelt's patience, Marshall's analytical clarity, Eisenhower's organizational genius, and Stalin's brutal insistence that together overcame Churchill's Mediterranean obsession and made D-Day possible. The beaches of Normandy, the names Utah and Omaha and Gold and Juno and Sword, are carved into history not just because of the soldiers who died there, but because of the political struggle that took place in conference rooms in Casablanca, Washington, Quebec, and Tehran. A struggle that most people have never heard about, because the story of the alliance is usually told as a story of unity, when the truth is far more complicated, far more human, and far more fascinating than any myth. If this story changed the way you see World War II and the men who shaped it, then please subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and share it with someone who deserves to know the real history behind D-Day. History is not made by monuments. It is made by arguments, by rivalries, by men sitting across tables from each other in the middle of a war, fighting over maps and plans and the lives of millions. Leave a comment below and tell us, what did you learn today that you didn't know before? Was it Churchill's resistance? Roosevelt's strategy? Stalin's role in Tehran? Your comment might be the one that inspires our next story. Thank you for watching. And remember, the past is never as simple as it seems, and the truth is always worth searching for.